The topic for today is Overview of Alaska Native Peoples, Lands, and Origins. A brief overview. I notice that I have brief in all caps, and it's not because I'm yelling at you, it's because I really do want to emphasize the word brief. Because what I'm going to be talking about today has to do with hundreds of different groups and thousands of years of history. So obviously one module is not going to do that justice. And indeed, we're going to be talking about these things throughout the entire semester, and this is really more, even less than an overview, kind of more like a trailer, a preview, maybe even a teaser trailer, like the awesome teaser trailer for the Batman that recently dropped. I was impressed. I was very impressed with Robert Pattinson. I did not see it at first, how he could be Batman. Anyways, I digress. So, why are overviews helpful? Well, I like to use this metaphor with my students. If you've never been to North America, and I was to start naming a bunch of cities that I've been to, like, oh, blah, 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 Buffalo, blah, 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 Portland, blah, 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 Denton, blah, 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 Toronto, you'd probably look at me like, what are you talking about? If I then at least gave you a map of North America, that would be slightly helpful. If I gave you a map of North America with the countries, states, and provinces drawn in, suddenly we're cooking with fire. We're cooking with oil? Yeah. Anyways, you'd start to get a sense of what I was actually talking about. So maps help orient us to a landscape. It's not that by having a map you suddenly know all the different things about all these different places, but at least you have some general patterns to fit it onto. And that's the idea of this module. Specifically, we're going to talk about some major patterns in the cultural groups and languages of Native Alaska. So the outline for today, we're going to go through the definition of cultures, then the land of Alaska, by which I mean the geography, and its impact on cultural diversity. We'll talk about languages, then we will talk about cultures, and then we will talk about the current population patterns. So first, let's talk about cultures. Kind of an important term, given the fact that it's right there in the title of the course. And I realized after the fact last week that I haven't actually defined cultures. And it's worth defining because the term sometimes gets used in different ways by different people. When you were in grade school, if there was like a World Cultures Day, probably the sense you would have gotten from that was like the culture is like the food people eat, maybe the language they speak, maybe sort of traditional dress. That's certainly part of what culture is. Culture is a lot more broad than that, though, in the way that we use it as social scientists. As anthropologists, when we talk about culture, what we really mean is the shared and learned ways that we think, communicate, and behave as groups. Shared in the sense that both you and I know what a red octagon means, even if it doesn't have the letters STOP in it. We know that it's a stop sign and what that means as we traverse the roads. And as that example suggests, culture makes for sort of shared understandings that allow us to coexist with relative minimums of sort of daily bumping into each other, shall we say. Culture is also learned, right? At some point, you picked up that red octagon means stop. You were not born with that knowledge. You did not, in the hospital, right after you were born, understand the rules of the road, right? So culture is shared and learned, and it encompasses what we think, our worldview, our values, how we talk to each other, how we communicate with each other, as well as actions. And it's holistic. And I say here, it ranges from the cosmic to the microscopic. And what I mean by that is it can include everything from what kind of eating utensil a group of people uses to something as weighty as what they see as the purpose of life. I said it's symbolic yet practical. And what I mean by that is for culture to be transmitted between human beings, you have to do so in large part through communication, right? You're not Professor X, I'm not Professor X, we're not telepaths. So if we're going to share ideas with each other, it's because we've communicated, which means we've used symbolism, whether that's language symbolism, art symbolism, something. At the same time, culture is very hands-on and practical, right? There's also a fair degree of culture that we learn. Let's say you want to be a good salmon fisher, you probably learned that from other salmon fishers out in a boat or on the river or in the tide fishing. You can probably sense from how I'm describing this that I'm not much of a salmon fisher. Culture is also powerful and yet at the same time negotiated. What I mean by that is cultures have a huge influence on how people think and live and communicate. At the same time, they're not all powerful by any stretch of the imagination. People push back on them and they also change over time. But all in all, culture is a way of life. Thus, you'll sometimes hear me use the term in this class, life ways, so way of life. And I put a little note here, without cultures we would all be dead, or rather we would not be alive. Human beings, from a physical standpoint, are a bit of evolutionary weaklings, right? I mean, we're okay, we're pretty decent distance runners, probably because of some peculiarities of how we sweat and breathe, which is kind of like not the coolest thing in the world. We don't have any claws, our teeth kind of suck, we're prone to back problems. We're not like going to win like coolest animal on the savannah competition anytime soon. But human beings have culture. And culture allows us to invent tools, and it allows us to invent meaning, and it allows us to cooperate as groups. And it's the reason that the human species has thrived over time. So culture is a very important concept. Now, we're using cultures in this class in the way that we often use the term culture, which is kind of interchangeable with the idea of a social group. Although if we wanted to be more technical about it, social groups are, well, groups of people. Cultures are the ways of life that the groups of people share amongst themselves. So it's the ideas and the practices, right? So group A has culture A, group B has culture B. So the culture isn't the people, the culture is the way of life of the people. Although actually individuals can have multiple cultural backgrounds, I suspect many of us do, groups can have multiple cultures, and cultures aren't isolated, they blend and blur into each other. So that's just to give us a sense when I start talking in a second about cultural diversity and cultures, to get a sense of what I mean when I say a culture. I really do mean that kind of holistic, overarching way of life. Now let's talk a little bit about the geography of Alaska and the implication that this has for native cultural diversity. Alaska is an amazing place. I think we all feel that way. I surveyed some of my students in my other class the other day about what they think of when they think of Alaska, and people said, independence and opportunity, but also, about the geography here. It's absolutely gorgeous. It's also very, very distinctive in a number of ways. First of all, it's very diverse. It has 39 separate mountain ranges, 3 million lakes, and 3 majorly different types of ecoregions. And what I mean by that is that we have essentially kind of tundra polar kind of stuff going on up here. We have essentially temperate forest, and then we also have kind of temperate coastal zones, as you see listed here. You have kind of blendings of things like boreal forests and rainforests, and again, tundra. And it makes for a landscape that's very diverse in terms of the types of habitats, and also very diverse geologically, right? And this might all seem like, well, what does this have to do with cultures? But you need to think, for example, when there's a mountain range, and then there's flatlands, and then there's coastal lands, those each set up different ways of making a living. And so when you have a lot of diversity of that in topography, you tend to get more cultural diversity. It's one of the reasons why California has dozens upon dozens of different native cultures, or did prior to colonialism, and many of these cultures are still around, thankfully. So places like California, like Alaska, where you get really diverse kind of topography and stuff, you tend to have a lot of cultural diversity. Now, in saying that, I don't want to sound like an environmental determinist, somebody that thinks environment equals culture. That's not what I'm saying. There's a million things that affect culture, but one of those things is topography, geography. The size of Alaska is also massive, if you haven't noticed. There's a stupid joke that one of my friends told me when I moved here from Texas, which is there's an Alaska senator and a Texas senator arguing, and the Alaska senator says, you better be careful if you keep this up. I might divide Alaska in half and make Texas the third biggest state. So yeah, Alaska's huge, right? It's a fifth the size of the continental U.S. That is also going to tend to lead towards there being quite a few different cultures just by sheer amount of size, right? And many different groups have moved into this region over time and set up shop in different parts of the subcontinent of Alaska. And then Alaska has one more thing about it that's worth mentioning with cultural diversity and the environment, which is that it has areas that are very sparse and it has areas that are very abundant. And sometimes those are actually the same area, depending on what we're talking about. So, for example, Kenai Peninsula, as well as Bristol Bay area, is extremely rich in salmon resources, as we know. Other regions are very rich. Other places are very rich. For example, shorebirds, which make for good eating, among other things. And I bring this up to suggest that when there are areas where you have a concentrated, really valuable resource, that's one thing that, number one, tends to have groups that sort of lay down roots and set up actual like sedentary, staying in one place kind of village kind of settlements. And then also, again, it's one of those things that affects cultural diversity because you have groups controlling specific areas and thus sort of branching away from other groups who are controlling other specific areas. At the same time, you have huge swaths of land like the Arctic and the north part of Alaska, where you have Inupiat groups who don't necessarily have that same dynamic, but at the same time, they do have local slight changes in the tundra and very, very specific adaptation village by village in terms of how to make a living on that piece of land. Even if it's all sort of generically tundra, it's not all generically tundra, there's little differences. So all of these factors lead to there being quite a bit of cultural diversity in Alaska. We have many, many different cultural groups in terms of the Alaska Native cultures here. And kind of, by the way, just for your own education, show off at a party, I don't know. The kind of way that I was just explaining how cultural diversity forms is a good example of what we sometimes call the cultural ecology model, or just cultural ecology. Basically, the idea first proposed by Julian Stewart back in the 40s, 30s, that 1930s. Oh, wow, how is it 2020? Why do I have to distinguish when things are in the 1900s? Anyways, Julian Stewart suggested that environment is a variable that kind of sits at the core of culture change and that drives many aspects, especially how we make a living, and that combined with the technologies we have available tend to drive a lot of other things in culture. So again, environment then is a major variable in how cultures develop. Take Inupiaq. So Inupiaq people, which is one of the main groups that we sometimes call Inuit people, have highly specialized, and I should say traditionally have, and to some degree still today practice this, highly specific forms of clothing based on furs, highly specific diet that relied heavily on certain kinds of animals, certain ways of preparing whale blubber, certain ways of eating seals, such as seal liver, to bring a balance of nutrients in an environment that is not very conducive to balanced nutrients because basically most of the vegetation is under snow and ice for most of the year, and so, or a large chunk of the year. So there's very specialized dietary practices, very specialized hunting practices, things like, some of you are probably familiar with this, the way in which is, traditionally Inupiaq people would use, or Inuit people use, like a bone that was used like a coiled spring that would be buried in meat, so that when wolves would try to eat basically the kills from Inuit people, they would spring to bone, but then kill the wolf. Highly specialized forms of transportation, both here and in other parts of Alaska. The kayak, of course, being invented in Alaska, it's an Alaska Native word. The igloo, which is just a genius adaptation to basically how to keep warmth in a highly frigid environment. All of these adaptations of Inupiaq people to their environment are incredibly sophisticated. Obviously, took centuries to sort of work out in this kind of perfection, but none of them are there just because, right? It's not like Inupiaq people back in the day were just like, hey, you know what? Igloos, that would be great. No, right? These are clearly things that are adaptations to a specific environment. So there's a lot of different factors then that can affect cultural development and cultural diversity, but environment's a huge one. Other ones, though, are things like individual creativity, right? Somebody had to invent kayaks, or perhaps several people had to invent kayaks. It was probably several generations of people sort of building on each other's inventions, but there had to be the individual creative people that were coming up with these different things that eventually became the kayak. There's also tradition, people's sacred teachings going back to time immemorial, from spiritual beings that have affected how their cultures have developed, economic practices and preferences, the influence of other groups in the area, colonialism, and much more.